Next, is a sampling. Audit sampling is the process of applying procedures to less than 100% of items within an account balances or class of transactions such that all the sampling units have an equal chance of selection. This is enable the auditor to obtain and evaluate audit evidence about some characteristics of the items selected. There are two types of audit sampling, first statistical sampling and second non-statistical sampling. Statistical sampling is an approach that using random selection of sample. It is use probability theory to evaluate the sample results. Statistical sampling also allows auditor to rely on a smaller sample for intensive checking. Non-statistical sampling is an approach that uses non-random selection methods. It needs more subjectivity in making sampling decisions. The auditor must rely on his professional judgment in making decisions such as choose and evaluate the sample. Then, auditor will select the sample item that gives useful information. There are three categories of statistical sampling. First, attribute sampling. Second, monetary sampling. Third, classical variable sampling. Attribute sampling is a sampling approach that used to estimate the proportion of a population that possesses specified characteristics. The most common use is for test of control, where auditor wants to determine the deviation rate for control implemented in accounting system and internal control structure. For example, auditor do examination on how frequent a credit check is not performed on customer orders before delivery the good or before approve another credit sales. Monetary unit sampling is an techniques that uses attribute sampling theory and techniques to estimate the amount of misstatement for organization account balances. It is designed primarily to test for overstatement errors in the sample. It expresses a conclusion in monetary amounts rather than as a rate of occurrence. As an example, auditing accounts receivable, loans and inventory. Classical variable sampling is an approach that uses normal distribution theory to evaluate the characteristics of a population based on the sample data. It is used to determine the range of the data when selecting the sample based on random table computer audit software. For example, checking, evaluating and auditing account receivable in which a large amount of misstatement is expected. There are a few advantages of statistical sampling. It helps auditors to design an efficient sample, helping the auditor and measure the sufficiency of evidence obtained. Permit the auditor to do more intensive examination of sample items with rely on smaller sample sizes. Statistical sampling also has disadvantages. For training auditor in the proper use of sampling approach will involve additional cost. In terms of software for design and conduct the sampling application, the firm will need additional cost to buy the software. Next, the advantages of non-statistical sampling. Auditor using non-statistical sampling because has a lower training cost of non-statistical sampling. It is easy to implement it and proposed adjustment based on quantitative analysis. For disadvantages of non-statistical sampling, there are no systematic ways which make the user feel the training is difficult to study and apply it. It also no consistency and uniformity because non-statistical sampling based on professional judgment of auditor. It will changes follow the situations. Moreover, it may cause wrong evaluation of sampling risk which get different results from examination carried out. There are similarities between statistical and non-statistical sampling in terms of steps of audit sampling. Firstly, planning the sample where auditor design the audit test to reduce sampling error. Secondly, selecting the sample where involves select the sample items. All sampling unit in population has chance to be selected. Thirdly, performing the audit procedure to meet the audit objectives. Lastly, evaluating the sample. This involves error analysis, projection of the error and draw a final conclusion. Differences between statistical and non-statistical sampling. For statistical sampling, auditor should have knowledge on statistical formula, but for non-statistical sampling, auditor make judgment based on experience and common sense. Next, statistical sampling. More to objective results, the sample are mathematically proven to represent population. For non-statistical sampling, it is more to subjective result where the sample may not represent population. For statistical sampling, different auditor with the same approach will give same results. However, for non-statistical sampling, different auditor will have different approach and also lead to give different result. Next, statistical sampling is an efficient method and can delegate the responsibility to select audit sample to lower-level audit staff. But, not an efficient method for non-statistical sampling. It need more senior audit staff to devise and choose the sample. There are common steps of application of sampling on audit tests whether for statistical or non-statistical sampling. First, planning or designing the sample. Second, selecting the sample. Third, testing the sample. Last, evaluating the results. First step, planning the sample. When designing an audit sample, the auditor should consider the objectives of the audit procedure and the attributes of the population from which the sample will be drawn. This is important to ensure that all, and only, those conditions that are relevant to the objectives of the audit procedure are included in the projection of errors. There are involves following steps in planning the sample. First, determine the objective of the test. Auditor need to consider specific objective to be achieved and the audit procedures to be performed towards this objective. Second, define what errors or deviations are being sought. Auditor need to consider the factors that constitute the error by referring the objective of the test. Third, identify the population and sampling unit. Auditor must be very careful to identify the population and sampling unit. Decide whether the population needs a subdiving into subpopulation or not, known as stratified the sampling. The objective is to focus greater audit work on areas that are of high inherent risk or potentially materially misstated. 4. Stratification of population. The process of dividing a population into subpopulations, each of which is a group of sampling units which have similar characteristics. 5. Decide the sample size. Auditor main concern is to reduce sampling risk to an acceptable low level. The larger the sample selected, the more representative of the population it is likely to be. Second step, selecting the sample. The sample that need to be selected is the sample that can be predicted to represent the population. All the items have an equal chance to be selected. There are 3 methods of selecting the sample that are random sample, systematic sample and haphazard sample. Generally, random sample is considered as the best method of obtaining a sample. A computerized or random number table is used to generate the random numbers to tests. The advantage using a random sample is to not allow the auditor to be biased, which will affect the selection of the sample. Systematic selection is a situation where the auditor determines a sampling interval by dividing the physical population by the sample size. For example, sample size is 15, and having determined a starting point within the first 3, each third sampling unit thereafter will be selected. Even though the starting point is may be determined haphazard, but the sample more likely to be random if it is determined by a computerized or random number tables. Haphazard sample is a method which selection of a sample without a specific reason or structured technique. It is useful for non-statistical sampling but not really recommended. This is because tend to be biased. This method is not appropriate when auditor using statistical sampling because the auditor cannot measure the probability of an item being selected. Third step, testing the sample. Auditor will perform audit procedure appropriate with the audit objective on each item that's selected. Due to void, the ample selected is not appropriate. If a selected item is not appropriate, the audit procedure need to be performed on a replacement item. As an example, a voided check may be choose when testing for evidence of payment authorization. If the auditor satisfied the check had been properly voided, thus it did not need constitute but another sample need to choose. Last step, evaluating the sample. Each error discovered will need to be examined for its implication. An error that consistent with expectations during the planning stage can be projected to have an impact on the population. Analyze nature and cause of error. Before drawing final conclusions about the population, the auditor should consider the qualitative aspect of error. Projecting the error. Auditor projects the sample result to the population tested and compares these results with the minimum error he willing to accept. Draw final conclusion. Auditor should evaluate the sample result to determine whether their assessment of population is confirmed or needs to be revised. When the results indicate error due to ineffective internal control or balance materially misstated, auditor should request management to investigate identified error, make any necessary adjustments or modify the nature, timing and extent of further audit procedures. That's all. Thank you for watching.